The deed was gone. Caroline Fairchild stood in the center of Sheriff Clement Redmond's office with her hands pressed flat against his desk, her dark eyes blazing with a fury that could have scorched the very floorboards beneath her boots. The lantern light caught the sharp angles of her face, the determined set of her jaw, and Clement found himself gripping the brim of his hat so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "You are telling me," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, each word measured and precise like a knife being drawn slowly from its sheath, "that the one piece of paper standing between my family's land and Harlan Voss's greed has simply vanished, and you are standing here telling me that the horseshoe nail I found at the scene is irrelevant." Clement met her gaze, and he felt the full force of her intelligence bearing down on him like a summer thunderstorm. He was not a man who backed down easily. 6 feet and 2 inches of frontier-forged muscle, a badge that had kept Redemption Creek honest for 4 years, and a reputation for being utterly unshakable had defined him. Yet something about Caroline Fairchild made him feel as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "Miss Fairchild," he said, and even he could hear the strained patience in his own voice. "A single nail found outside the land registry office doesn't—" "That nail," she said, cutting him off with a precision that left no room for argument, "is hand-forged. The pattern on its head is a double-struck cross, which means it came from Silas Prout's smithy, not from the traveling farrier who services this end of town. Silas Prout shoes exactly 3 horses in this county with that particular pattern, because he made a custom die 3 years ago for Harlan Voss's personal stable." She straightened, pulled a folded piece of paper from the pocket of her apron and laid it on the desk in front of him. "I wrote down the names of those 3 horses and their riders. You are welcome to verify it." The silence that followed was absolute. Clement stared at the paper. Then he looked at her. The fury in her eyes had not diminished, but beneath it was something else, the controlled, methodical certainty of someone who had done the work while he had been dismissing the evidence. He had been wrong. Completely and undeniably wrong. And in that moment, with the lantern flickering between them and the distant sound of Redemption Creek's saloon drifting through the walls, Clement Redmond felt something crack open inside his chest that had been sealed shut for a very long time. But to understand how they had arrived at this scorching, electric moment in the failing light of a Tuesday evening, with a missing deed and a horseshoe nail between them, you had to go back 3 weeks, to the day Caroline Fairchild rode into Redemption Creek with her medical bag and her grief and her extraordinary, dangerous mind. The territory of New Mexico in the autumn of 1882 was not a gentle place. The land was vast and beautiful and utterly indifferent to the people who tried to claim it, and Redemption Creek sat at the edge of a contested valley where the Fairchild family had ranched for 11 years. The town itself had grown up around a crossroads, a church, a general store, a land registry, 2 saloons, and the kind of stubborn permanence that frontier settlements either achieved or abandoned. Sheriff Clement Redmond had arrived 4 years earlier from Texas, hired by the town council after his predecessor had been shot during a land dispute that had left 3 men dead and the whole territory nervous. Clement had cleaned things up. Not with recklessness, but with the quiet, methodical authority of a man who understood that the law was only as strong as the people willing to enforce it with patience as much as with force. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and brown eyes that had seen enough trouble to know when more was coming. He wore his badge without ceremony and his gun without eagerness, and the people of Redemption Creek respected him for both. He had not expected Caroline Fairchild. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in early October, riding a gray mare with a calm confidence that made several men on the main street stop and stare. She was 27, which the town would learn only gradually, because her manner suggested someone who had been thinking carefully about the world for considerably longer than that. She wore practical clothing, a dark blue skirt over sturdy boots, a white blouse already showing the dust of the road, her brown hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She carried a medical bag across the saddle, and dismounted outside the general store with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since before she could properly read. Caroline was a healer. That was how Redemption Creek would come to know her, though the word hardly captured the full dimensions of what she was. She had learned medicine from her father, Dr. Arthur Fairchild, who had studied in Philadelphia before the pull of open land and a young wife had brought him west. He had taught Caroline everything: botany, anatomy, the careful mixing of compounds, the reading of symptoms that other people's eyes skimmed past. When Arthur Fairchild died of a fever 3 years earlier, Caroline had quietly assumed his role on the family ranch and in the surrounding community, because there was no one else within 40 miles who could set a broken bone correctly or identify a plant toxin from a patient's symptoms. Her mother, Helen Fairchild, had followed Arthur to the grave 18 months later, worn down by grief and a hard winter. That left Caroline and her younger brother Thomas, who was 22 and good-hearted, and completely unprepared for what Harlan Voss had begun to do to their family. Harlan Voss was the kind of man the frontier produced with alarming regularity: wealthy, connected, and convinced that the law existed primarily to serve his convenience. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and had spent the better part of 2 years quietly buying up smaller parcels of land throughout the valley. The Fairchild land sat at the center of his ambitions because it controlled access to the only reliable year-round water source for 30 miles. He had offered to buy it. The Fairchilds had refused. He had offered again, at a lower price, which was the way men like Voss communicated their intentions. The Fairchilds had refused again. And then, 3 weeks before Caroline rode into Redemption Creek, the deed to the Fairchild property had disappeared from the county land registry. Thomas had ridden to town immediately, pale and shaking, and had been met with the courteous bureaucratic helplessness of a registrar's office that had no explanation, and a sheriff who had, at that first meeting, been professionally sympathetic and privately skeptical. Clement had examined the office, found no signs of a break-in that he could identify immediately, and had filed a report. He had also, privately, considered the possibility that the Fairchilds had mismanaged their paperwork and were embarrassed about it. He had not yet met Caroline. She arrived in town on that Wednesday morning because Thomas had written to her, because she had been 2 days' ride north attending a difficult childbirth at the Morrison homestead, and because she had read her brother's letter and felt the specific quality of fear that comes not from uncertainty, but from recognizing a trap that is already closing. She went to the land registry first. The registrar, a nervous man named Philip Dunmore, gave her the same explanation he had given Thomas, which amounted to an elaborate description of his own confusion. Caroline listened to every word without interrupting, and then she asked a series of questions so precise and methodical that Dunmore found himself answering them before he had quite decided whether he should. When had he last personally verified the deed's location? Who else had keys to the filing room? Had there been any unusual visitors in the 2 weeks prior to the discovery of the missing document? Had anything else been moved or disturbed? What was the condition of the lock on the filing room door? Dunmore answered all of it. And then Caroline thanked him, walked out of the registry, and went around to the side of the building where the filing room's single external window faced a narrow alley. That was where she found the horseshoe nail. It was half embedded in the soft earth beneath the window, which showed faint marks along its lower edge that might have been from a tool used to work the latch. The nail was unremarkable to the untrained eye: small, dark with age and use, the kind of object that accumulated around any building in a working town. But Caroline had grown up on a ranch, had spent 11 years watching horses being shod and metal being worked, and she recognized immediately that the pattern stamped into the nail's head was distinctive. She picked it up carefully, wrapped it in a square of clean linen from her medical bag, and walked directly to the sheriff's office. Clement Redmond had been at his desk when she walked in, going over a report about a cattle dispute on the north side of the county. He looked up, took in the sight of a woman he did not recognize standing in his doorway with the kind of quiet authority that immediately rearranged his expectations, and set down his pen. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I believe so," she said. "My name is Caroline Fairchild. My family's deed has been stolen, and I have found evidence that I suspect is relevant to identifying the person responsible." Clement gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat, opened her medical bag, and produced the linen-wrapped nail. He examined it. He turned it over in his fingers. He set it down on his desk with the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to appear dismissive, but was, in fact, doing precisely that, because a nail found in the dirt outside a building in a working town meant very little to him. "Miss Fairchild," he said, "this is a horseshoe nail. I could find a dozen of them between here and the livery stable without much effort." That was the beginning of their argument. Caroline's explanation about the hand-forged pattern and Silas Prout's custom die was delivered with controlled patience for approximately 2 minutes before she recognized, with the unerring diagnostic instinct she applied to everything, that he was not truly listening. He was being polite, which was not the same thing. And so her patience had burned away like morning frost, and she had arrived at the sharp, blazing moment that had preceded their standoff across his desk. When she laid the paper with the 3 horse names on his desk and he fell silent, the quality of the silence changed. She watched him read the names. She watched him process them. She watched the moment he recognized that she was right. Clement looked up from the paper and met her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "How do you know which horses Sila's shoes with which nails?" he asked, and his voice had changed. The professional caution was still there, but the dismissiveness was entirely gone. "Because I treat those horses," she said simply. "I do not have a formal veterinary education, but I learned animal medicine alongside human medicine. Old Silas is 71, and his eyesight is failing. He has trusted me to examine his animals for the past 2 years. 3 horses in Harlan Voss's stable require my attention regularly: a buckskin with chronic thrush, a bay with a recurring tendon injury, and a gray that is prone to respiratory trouble. I know every shoe on every one of those animals because I have to account for how the shoeing affects their movement and their health. The nail under that window came from one of those 3 horses." Clement was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up the nail again, looked at it more carefully, and set it down with entirely different energy than before. "That is impressive diagnostic work," he said, and there was nothing performative about the statement. It came out simply, honestly, the way a man acknowledges a truth that has arrived at him sideways. Caroline blinked. She had expected more resistance. She had prepared arguments for it. The absence of resistance left her momentarily uncertain how to proceed. "Thank you," she said, and the formality between them cracked just slightly at the edges. Clement stood, reached for his hat, and settled it on his head. "I'd like to visit Silas Prout this afternoon," he said, "and then I'd like to have a conversation with Harlan Voss. I'd be obliged if you came with me to the smithy, since you know more about this than I do." The acknowledgement landed somewhere unexpected in Caroline's chest. She nodded, stood, and followed him out into the pale October sun. Silas Prout's smithy sat at the southern edge of town, smelling of coal and hot iron and the deep, working smell of a place where useful things were made. The old blacksmith himself was a small, leathery man with enormous hands and the kind of face that had been weathered into a kind of rough dignity. He squinted at them both when they arrived, pushing his spectacles up his nose. Clement let Caroline lead the conversation, which surprised Silas, and if she was being entirely honest with herself, surprised Caroline a little as well. Most men in law enforcement, in her experience, led every conversation as a matter of territorial instinct. Clement stepped back and listened, arms crossed, hat shading his face, and she felt his attention on her as a specific, tangible thing. She showed Silas the nail. He turned it over once and said, "That's mine." "Can you tell which horse it came from?" Caroline asked. Silas studied the nail under better light for a moment. The double cross, the size, the weight of it, that's the batch I made for Mr. Voss's buckskin. That horse throws shoes regular because of how the front left hoof grows. I reshod him maybe 3 weeks back. Clement wrote this down carefully in his small notebook. Do you remember seeing anyone near Voss's horse in the days before or after you reshod him? Clement asked. Silas thought about it. Voss's man Decker was in and out. Decker runs the stable. Clement's expression didn't change, but Caroline saw the slight tension that moved through his jaw. She filed it away. They walked back toward the main street in the thin autumn afternoon, and Clement was quiet for long enough that Caroline glanced at him sideways. You know Decker, she said. It was not a question. He looked at her and she thought she saw the edge of something reluctant move across his face. Wade Decker has been in trouble before, he said. Nothing I could make stick, he's careful. What kind of trouble? The kind that tends to benefit Harlan Voss without Voss's name ever appearing in the official account of things. He paused. Miss Fairchild, I want to be straightforward with you. Going at Voss directly today without more evidence would be a mistake. He has lawyers in Santa Fe who would have any case I built dismissed before it got to a judge. Caroline looked at him steadily. Then we need more evidence. Yes, he said, we do. We settled between them like something that had been waiting to be said. They decided, without formally agreeing to collaborate, to meet the following morning at the land registry to go back over everything Dunmore could tell them. Caroline walked back to the hotel where she had taken a room. The Fairchild land was 2 hours' ride from town, and she had no intention of leaving until this was resolved, and Clement went back to his office. He sat at his desk for a while after she left, turning the horseshoe nail over in his fingers. He thought about the way she had explained the nail's origin with the same calm precision that a trained attorney might present evidence. He thought about the paper she had laid on his desk, the careful, neat handwriting, the 3 horse names, the detail of the shoeing pattern. He thought about how completely, comprehensively wrong he had been to dismiss it. That kind of error bothered him. He was a careful man. He had been lazy, or rather, he had made an assumption based on appearance, a woman arriving with a single small piece of physical evidence, and a claim that seemed thin at first glance, and his assumption had nearly buried the only solid lead in the case. It was the kind of mistake he did not intend to repeat. He also thought, in a more private corner of his mind that he did not examine very closely, about the particular quality of her attention when she had explained the nail, the absolute surety in her voice, the way she had not raised it, had not performed the certainty for effect, had simply stated what she knew because she knew it. He found that specific quality, that quiet, unperformable competence, more striking than anything he had encountered in a long time. He put the nail in his desk drawer and went to speak with his deputy. The next morning was cold, a sharp edge to the October air that made the horses blow steam in the early light. Caroline was at the land registry when Clement arrived, already deep in conversation with Dunmore, who had spread every accessible record related to the Fairchild property across his broad desk. Clement stopped in the doorway and watched for a moment before either of them noticed him. Caroline was tracing something on a document with one finger, asking Dunmore a question about when the last formal verification of the filing room's contents had been conducted. Dunmore was consulting a ledger. The efficiency of it, no wasted motion, no performative helplessness, just clear systematic thinking, was something Clement watched with the specific attention of a man who was beginning to understand that he had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. He stepped in. Dunmore looked relieved to see him. Caroline looked up, met his eyes with a brief, professional nod, and continued her thought. The last formal inventory of the filing room was in March, she said to Clement, as naturally as though they had already been working side by side for hours, which means the theft could have occurred at any point in the 7 months since then. But Thomas received official notice of the property's registration status in July, which means the deed was present at least as late as mid-July. That narrows it to roughly 10 weeks, Clement said. 8, Caroline said. Thomas came in to update the record of a boundary marker in early August. Dunmore confirmed he saw the deed at that time. Clement looked at Dunmore. Dunmore nodded. 8 weeks. Clement turned this over. Voss made his second offer on the Fairchild land in August, he said. 2 weeks after that update, he watched the information land on Caroline and reorganize itself behind her eyes. He knew the deed was current, she said slowly. He checked or had someone check before he made the offer. When the offer was refused, he needed to change the situation, Clement finished. They looked at each other across Dunmore's desk, and the first real thread of something, not just professional respect, not just the heat of shared urgency, pulled taut between them. Caroline looked away first, back at the documents. Clement was glad because he was not entirely certain his face was behaving with complete neutrality. Over the following days, they built the case carefully. Caroline visited Voss's property on the pretext of tending to the buckskin with the chronic thrush, a legitimate professional call that no one could question, and observed the layout of the stables, the pattern of the staff's movements, and most critically, a stack of papers on the desk in Voss's outer office that included what appeared to be a draft of a property claim document bearing the Fairchild Land Survey coordinates. She did not touch it. She memorized it. When she described it to Clement that evening in his office, she had fallen into the habit of stopping by after supper, and he had fallen into the habit of having coffee ready, which neither of them had formally negotiated. He listened with his elbows on his desk and his full attention on her face. "You memorized the survey coordinates from a document you saw for approximately 40 seconds across a room," he said. "I have a good memory for numbers," she said, without false modesty. "It comes from years of calculating compound measurements. A healer who cannot hold precise numbers in mind can kill someone by accident." Clement was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you write them down?" She wrote them down. He compared them against the official county survey record that he had obtained from the registrar. They matched exactly. "Voss has already drawn up a claim document," he said. "He is planning to file it on the basis that the property has no recorded deed and the land is therefore open for claim." "Which it is not," Caroline said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Our family has worked that land for 11 years. My father built the original structure. My mother is buried there." The raw edge of that last sentence surprised them both. Caroline pressed her lips together briefly, and Clement felt the ache of it as though it were his own. "We are going to fix this," he said quietly, and something in the steadiness of his voice made her look at him directly. "I give you my word." She studied him for a moment, the way a healer studies a patient, Clement thought, reading everything visible for signs of what lies beneath. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once, with the careful gravity of someone who did not extend trust easily and meant it fully when she did. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Caroline was in the middle of treating a young ranch hand named Pete Calloway, who had come to her hotel room complaining of a deep cut on his forearm. She cleaned and stitched the wound with efficient, practiced hands, and while she worked, Pete talked in the rambling way of someone trying to keep his mind off the pain. He worked for a smaller ranch on the eastern edge of the valley. He had been in Voss's stables 3 weeks ago, delivering a message from his employer, and he had seen something he had not known was significant until he mentioned it almost as an afterthought. "I saw Decker in the back room with some papers," Pete said. "Had them spread out under the lamp middle of the afternoon. Seemed peculiar is all, since Decker isn't exactly a reading man." "What kind of papers?" Caroline asked, tying off the last suture with careful hands. Pete shrugged. "Old ones, brown around the edges, and there was a little tin box on the table, the kind registry offices use for their important files. I know because my daddy worked in one back in Missouri." Caroline's hands did not tremble, because she had trained them not to. But her mind had gone very still in the particular way it went still when something critical snapped into place. She thanked Pete, saw him out, and walked straight to Clement's office through the deepening evening with her coat half-buttoned and her heart beating in a way that had nothing to do with romantic feeling and everything to do with the specific urgency of being close to truth. She told him what Pete had said. Clement listened without moving. Then he said, "If the deed is still at Voss's property in that tin box, then Decker is the link between the theft and Voss." "Can you search the property?" Caroline asked. Clement's jaw tightened. "Not without cause that will hold up legally. If I go in there without proper standing and we find it, a lawyer will argue the evidence is tainted and Voss will walk away clean." He was quiet for a moment, thinking with the same careful, methodical energy she had come to recognize in him over the past week. "I need Decker to make a mistake." Caroline sat very still. "Or I need to see it again." Clement looked at her sharply. "Absolutely not. The buckskin needs a follow-up examination," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "I told Voss's stable manager when I visited last week that I would return to check the thrush treatment. It is a completely legitimate professional visit. If Decker has the deed there and he recognizes that you know about it, he does not know what I know," she said. "He does not know about Pete Calloway. He does not know about the nail, the survey coordinates, or any of it. To Decker and Voss, I am the local healer who tends their horses." Clement stood up from his desk and walked to the window, which he often did when something was working against his preferences. He stood with his back to her, and Caroline watched the set of his shoulders, the controlled frustration of a man trying to find an argument that would hold. He turned back around. "I am coming with you," he said. "Not as the sheriff, as a man accompanying his." He stopped. Caroline raised an eyebrow. "As a man who is helping you carry your equipment," he said, with the expression of someone making the best of limited options. Something that might, in a different emotional climate, have been a smile moved briefly across Caroline's face. "I do not generally require assistance with my equipment," she said. "You do today," he said flatly, and reached for his coat. They rode out to Voss's property the following morning in a thin, cold October light that made the dry grass look like hammered silver. Clement had left his badge in his desk drawer. He wore plain clothes, dark trousers, a work shirt, his coat. Without the badge, he was simply a large, capable-looking man with careful eyes, and Caroline noticed that several of Voss's hands barely looked at him twice. She went through the veterinary examination of the buckskin with meticulous thoroughness, which required no performance because the horse genuinely needed attention. She talked to the stable manager, a quiet man named Arlo, with the easy professional warmth she brought to all her patients' caregivers. And she watched. Clement moved around the edges of the stable with the unhurried ease of someone waiting for nothing in particular, which was itself a skill she had not expected from him. He was observant without appearing to observe, present without drawing attention. She filed this quality away alongside the others she had been quietly assembling. She did not see the tin box, but she saw something else. On the back wall of the stable's storage room, among the various records that working stables keep, feed tallies, farrier schedules, horse health records, was a neatly folded paper that had been wedged between two boards, perhaps hastily, perhaps as a temporary measure. It was too far away to read, but the edge of it visible at the fold showed the particular pale cream color and official stamp border of county registry documents. She did not react. She finished the examination, accepted payment from Arlo with calm courtesy, and waited until she and Clement were a full half-mile down the road before she said, in a voice that was very level, "There is a county registry document hidden in the storage room wall." Clement turned his head to look at her. "Show me exactly what you saw." She described it, the color, the stamp border, the fold, the position. Clement asked 3 clarifying questions and then went quiet for the rest of the ride back to town. He was thinking. She had learned his thinking silences by now, recognized them as distinct from his disapproving silences and his professionally neutral silences and the increasingly frequent silences that felt like something else entirely, something warmer and less categorizable that she was not quite ready to examine. By the time they reached Redemption Creek, he had a plan. The plan involved Pete Calloway, a formal sworn statement, and the specific legal standard for obtaining a search warrant in the territory of New Mexico, which Clement knew in considerable detail, because he had needed to navigate it twice before in cases involving Voss-adjacent situations. It also involved riding to the county seat and back in a day and a half, which was hard on horses but possible. Caroline spent those day and a half making herself useful in ways that had nothing to do with the deed and everything to do with the town. She attended to 2 patients who had been waiting for her attention, a child with a respiratory infection and an elderly woman with a badly managed wound on her leg that had required more skill and more patience than most physicians would have brought to it. She also called on Thomas, who had ridden in from the ranch, and spent an evening with him that was difficult and warm and necessary. Thomas was good-hearted and frightened, and he looked at his older sister with the complete trust that only younger siblings who have been raised by someone's competence can produce. Caroline felt the weight of it, and the love, and the specific loneliness of being the one who carries things. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough to know that it was being handled, that she was not alone in it, that the sheriff was on their side. She did not tell him how much she had come to rely, in a very short time, on the sheriff's particular steadiness, that she kept for the privacy of her own thoughts. Clement returned with the warrant on a cold, bright Thursday morning. He had dark circles under his eyes from hard riding and looked simultaneously exhausted and electrified. Caroline met him outside the livery stable as he dismounted and handed his horse to the stable boy, and the look that passed between them when their eyes met contained something she could not quite name and did not try to. "We have until noon," he said. "The warrant specifies the storage room and the filing areas. I have 2 deputies and a county officer who rode back with me." "How did you manage the warrant so quickly?" she asked. "I had the survey coordinates, the sworn statement from Pete Calloway, the testimony from Silas Prout, and a letter from Philip Dunmore confirming the theft. I presented them to Judge Harmon at the county seat and he granted the warrant in 4 hours. He paused. I also told him about the nail." She stared at him. "The nail that you originally told me was irrelevant." He met her eyes with the straightforward honesty of a man who does not hide his own errors once he has acknowledged them. "Yes," he said, "that one." They held the look for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. The search of Voss's property was conducted with the precise, documented efficiency that legal requirements demanded. Clement led his team through the stable with the warrant in hand, and Voss himself standing in the yard with the expression of someone who is very controlled and very furious. 2 of his lawyers, who had apparently been summoned from somewhere with considerable speed, stood beside him looking at documents. Caroline was not officially part of the search party. She stood near the fence with Thomas, who had ridden out when she sent him word, and watched. It took 11 minutes. Clement emerged from the storage room carrying a tin box. He set it on a stable block in the open air, in full view of Voss and his lawyers and the county officer, and opened it in front of witnesses. Inside was the Fairchild deed. Also inside was a handwritten document in Voss's hand, dated 2 weeks after the deed's disappearance, outlining a plan to file a fraudulent land claim on the basis of the property being unregistered. Also inside, wrapped carefully in oilskin, was a second deed that turned out to belong to the Merriman family, who had lost their land claim 6 months earlier under circumstances that had been attributed to lost paperwork. The Merriman discovery changed everything. What had appeared to be a case involving a single stolen deed was now evidence of a systematic pattern of deed theft and fraudulent land acquisition. Wade Decker, confronted with the physical evidence and the reality that his employer was already in discussion with the county officer about formal charges, made the calculation that men like Decker often make when the ground shifts beneath them. He talked. Decker's testimony took 3 hours, was conducted in Clement's office with a county officer present, and implicated Voss in the theft of 4 deeds over 18 months. The Fairchild deed was the most recent. The Merriman deed was the one that had successfully displaced a family. The Merrimans had left the territory after losing their claim, believing the paperwork loss was their own error. Caroline sat outside during Decker's testimony, on the bench in front of the sheriff's office with Thomas beside her. The sun had moved to the afternoon position and the air was crisp and clean, and the sky was the particular deep blue of the high New Mexico autumn. Thomas held his hat in both hands and said very little. After a while he said, "You figured it out, didn't you? Not just the sheriff." "We figured it out together," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the younger sibling's specific, unfiltered perception, "You like him." Caroline looked at the sky. "He is a good sheriff," she said. Thomas smiled at his boots. The formal proceedings moved with the ponderous slowness of territorial legal processes, but the outcome was not in doubt. Voss was taken into custody the following morning. Decker was held as a material witness. The Fairchild deed was officially returned to the registry and formally verified, its status placed beyond further challenge. A telegraph was sent to locate the Merriman family to inform them of the recovery of their stolen deed and their right to contest the fraudulent claim on their former property. Caroline rode out to the ranch with Thomas that afternoon to see for herself that the land was still there, still theirs, still holding the memory of her parents in its dry grass and its weathered fence posts, and the small wooden cross above her mother's grave on the eastern slope. She stood there for a long time in the late October light, and the grief and the love and the pure relief of it moved through her in waves that she did not try to hold back. When she rode back to town the following morning, she went to the sheriff's office. She told herself she was going to return the official copy of the survey coordinates she had written down. She told herself it was a purely administrative visit. Clement was at his desk. He looked up when she walked in, and the particular quality of his attention, the way it gathered, focused, became entirely present, had stopped surprising her. She was beginning to expect it. She was beginning to need it in a way that made her uncomfortable and alive simultaneously. She placed the survey document on his desk. He looked at it, then at her. "The Merrimans have been located," he said. "They are in Colorado. I received a telegraph this morning. They are coming back." "That is wonderful," she said, and meant it. "You are responsible for that," he said. "Your observation in the storage room, your identification of the nail. Without either of those things, none of this would have moved fast enough. Without the warrant you obtained in 4 hours," she said, "the document could have been moved." He looked at her steadily. "I think we were each necessary." The sentence was simple, and it arrived with the precision of something that had been considered before being spoken. Caroline looked at the surface of his desk because looking at his face felt, in that moment, like something she needed to approach gradually. "I should probably be returning home," she said. "Thomas needs help preparing the ranch for winter, and my patients in the outlying areas have been patient about my absence." "Yes," Clement said, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be notable. She looked up. He was still watching her, and there was something in his face, not the professional neutrality, not the careful authority, but something underneath both of those things that had been there for several days, and that he was no longer quite managing to keep covered. "Miss Fairchild," he said, and stopped. She waited. He looked at her the way he had looked at the horseshoe nail the second time he had picked it up, with the full, honest attention of someone who has set aside his previous assumptions and is seeing clearly. "Would you have supper with me this evening?" he asked. "Not to discuss the case. There is no remaining business with the case that requires your presence." He paused. "I would simply like to have supper with you." The words were direct and unadorned, and they were entirely him, she thought. No performance, no elaborate phrasing, simply the honest request of a man who had decided to be honest. Caroline looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." They had supper at the hotel's dining room, which was the best option Redemption Creek offered, which meant white tablecloths of varying cleanliness and a menu that included a roast that was respectable if not remarkable. Clement had clearly made some effort with his appearance, a clean shirt, his hair combed, though the wind had already made some initial corrections to that, and Caroline had changed into the better of her two dresses, a dark green wool that her mother had helped her make 3 winters ago and that still fit well. They talked for 2 hours, not about the deed, not about Voss or Decker or the legal proceedings. They talked about what had brought each of them to the territory. Caroline told him about her father's teaching, about learning to read a patient's color and breathing, and the way they held their body with the same attention that a tracker reads ground, about the loneliness of being the only medically trained person in a wide radius, about the specific satisfaction of a diagnosis that held, a treatment that worked, a person who recovered. Clement told her about Texas, about learning law enforcement from a sheriff in Abilene, who had been old and experienced and surprisingly patient, with a young deputy who had thought that strength was the primary tool of the work. About learning over years that the most important thing was not force but attention, paying attention to people, understanding what they were actually afraid of, what they actually wanted, what they were actually doing behind what they appeared to be doing. That is not entirely different from diagnosis, Caroline said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him across the table. Do you ever miss Texas? He considered this honestly. Sometimes. But the work here is important, and the people are good people mostly. He paused. And I have found recently that I am less interested in elsewhere than I was before. She held his gaze and felt the warmth of that sentence settle somewhere central. They walked out of the hotel into the cold night air, and Redemption Creek was quiet around them, the stars very sharp and close in the dry air. They stood on the boardwalk and neither of them moved to leave. I need to tell you something, Caroline said. I am not a woman who is easily managed. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely genuine. I had noticed. I do not mean it as a warning, she said. I mean it as information. I have spent years being the person who makes the decisions and holds things together and knows what to do. It is not a posture I put on. It is simply who I am. I know, he said, and it has made it difficult, she continued more quietly, to imagine being with anyone who would find that quality inconvenient. Clement was silent for a moment. The street was empty around them and his breath made a soft cloud in the cold air. The first time I picked up that nail and told you it was irrelevant, he said, I was wrong. You were right. And when you told me why and I understood how completely right you were, I did not feel threatened by it. He looked at her steadily. I felt something that I have been trying to name ever since, and I think the most accurate word for it is admiration. The word landed in the quiet night air between them. Caroline felt her throat tighten in the way it only did when something was genuinely true and genuinely important. That is a good word, she said, her voice a little lower than usual. He reached up and very carefully, with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him, tucked a strand of hair that the wind had loosened back from her face. His hand was warm in the cold air. She did not move away. Will you stay a few more days, he asked, before you go back to the ranch? Yes, she said, and then, because she was Caroline Fairchild and honesty was its own form of courage, I think I would like that. The days that followed were the best she had spent in a long time. She saw her patients in the morning. There were 3 people in Redemption Creek who had been waiting for her attention, and she addressed each case with full care. She helped Thomas finalize the documentation with the land registry that formally secured the deed against any further challenge. She reviewed the compound prescriptions she had left with a general store owner who was serving as her informal pharmacy when she was not in town, making adjustments and leaving careful written instructions. And in the evenings, Clement came to find her. Sometimes they walked. Sometimes they sat in his office and talked while he worked through his paperwork, and she found that being in the same room while they each attended to their separate tasks was comfortable in a way that felt profound precisely because she had not expected it. She had always worked alone. The idea of someone else's presence in her working space had always seemed like an encumbrance. With him, It was the opposite. One afternoon, a woman came to Caroline in some distress, a young wife, recently arrived in the territory, who had been suffering symptoms that suggested a difficult early pregnancy. Caroline examined her with care and patience, and afterwards spent an hour explaining the situation, what was normal, what to watch for, what remedies were safe and what were not. The young woman left steadier and better informed than she had arrived. Clement had been in the next room and had heard the careful, detailed explanation Caroline gave. When the woman left, he came to the doorway and looked at Caroline with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was beyond admiration, something warmer and more personal. "You are extraordinary at that," he said. She was putting away her instruments. She did not look up immediately because the words had caught her somewhere vulnerable. "At what?" "Making people feel less afraid," he said. "You give them information and tools and you treat them as though they are intelligent and capable of handling what is true. Most people don't do that." She looked at him then. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the afternoon light was good on his face, and she thought, "I have not wanted to be known by someone in a very long time, and I want this person to know me." "My father taught me that," she said. "He said the most dangerous thing a healer can do is protect a patient from the truth of their own condition. He said people deserve to understand what is happening inside them. He sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I knew," she said, "until recently." The words had come out before she had entirely examined them, and she watched Clement's face absorb them with the careful, unguarded pleasure of someone who has received something valuable and knows it. He crossed the room to where she stood slowly, and stood close enough that the warmth of him was something she could feel even through the layers of her clothing. "Caroline," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix. "Clement," she said, which was the first time she had used his. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, quietly, deliberately, without performance, and with a thoroughness that suggested he had been thinking about it for some days. She kissed him back with equal honesty, and the particular loneliness that she had carried for 3 years, the loneliness of being capable and alone, loosened around its edges and began to release. November arrived and brought with it the first serious cold of the season. The Voss legal proceedings were moving through the territorial court, with the gravity that multiple counts of deed fraud and criminal conspiracy warranted. Voss himself remained in custody pending trial, which was set for February in the county seat. Decker had entered a formal cooperation agreement that, while it reduced his own exposure considerably, guaranteed the completeness of the case against his employer. The Merrimans arrived in Redemption Creek on the 12th of November, a family of 5 husband, wife, and 3 children who had spent 6 months in Colorado believing they had simply lost what was theirs through their own carelessness. The husband, a quiet man named Robert Merriman, sat in Clement's office and read the formal account of what had been done to his family and said nothing for a long time. His wife wept. Caroline sat with Mrs. Merriman while Clement dealt with the legal particulars. She held the woman's hand and said nothing beyond what was needed, because sometimes the most important medical intervention is simply the human presence of someone who is not afraid of your pain. Clement watched from across the room and felt the fullness of why he had fallen in love with her settle definitively into place. He had not said those words yet, even to himself, fully. But he said them now, in the privacy of his own chest, and found they had clearly been there for some time without his formal acknowledgement. The Merrimans would need legal assistance to contest the fraudulent claim on their land, and the process would take time. Clement connected them with the county officer who had handled the original warrant and wrote a personal letter to Judge Harmon outlining the circumstances. It was not a guaranteed outcome, but it was a legitimate fighting chance, and the judge's initial response suggested he was favorably disposed. Caroline returned to the ranch in mid-November to help Thomas prepare for winter properly. She was gone for 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks had a specific texture that Clement noticed with a clarity he found slightly alarming. His office was the same. His work was the same. But the evenings, which had become a thing he moved toward, were now simply evenings again. He wrote to her. He was not a natural letter writer, and he knew it, and the first letter was somewhat formal and almost entirely about the legal proceedings, with a brief final paragraph that said he hoped the ranch preparations were going well, and that he was looking forward to her return to Redemption Creek. Her reply arrived 6 days later. It covered 3 pages, discussed the ranch preparations in practical detail, mentioned 2 interesting medical cases she had attended in the surrounding area during her time there, described a plant she had found growing on the eastern ridge that had properties she was still researching, and ended with a paragraph that was not formal at all, and that Clement read twice, and then a third time. She said that she had spent a great deal of time thinking, in the clean, cold air and the open space of the ranch, about what she wanted her life to look like going forward. She said that she had always assumed that the constraints of her work and her independence meant that certain things were simply not available to her, or rather, that having them would require compromising things she was not willing to compromise. She said that she was beginning to think she had been mistaken about that, and that the revision of a previous error when the evidence warranted it was simply good reasoning. She signed it, Caroline. Clement sat with the letter for a long while. Then he got up, went to the general store, and asked the proprietor to order a particular medical reference text from Santa Fe that he had heard Caroline mention once, in passing, as something she had been wanting access to for a year. She came back to town in early December for the formal preliminary hearing in the Voss case, which required her sworn testimony about her observations at the property. She gave the testimony with precise, clear language that made the defense attorney noticeably uncomfortable and made Judge Harmon lean slightly forward in his chair. After the hearing, she and Clement had supper again at the hotel dining room, and the white tablecloths were somewhat cleaner than before, and the roast was better, and the conversation moved between legal strategy and botany and childhood memories, and the specific challenge of maintaining a wood stove through a New Mexico winter. And when they walked out into the cold December night, Clement stopped on the boardwalk and turned to face her. "I have something for you," he said, and produced from inside his coat a wrapped package that was clearly a book. Caroline unwrapped it in the lamplight. It was a copy of Gray's Anatomy, the 1882 edition, which was the most current available and which she had been trying to obtain for over a year. She looked at it. She looked at him. "How did you know?" she asked. "You mentioned it," he said, 3 weeks ago in the office. You were telling me about a case involving a joint injury and you said there was a reference you had been wanting. I said that once," she said, "in passing." "I pay attention," he said simply. She held the book against her chest and looked at him in the lamplight, and felt something she recognized from her medical training as the specific symptom of a heart working considerably harder than resting conditions required. "Clement," she said. "Yes. I think I am in love with you," she said, with the same clarity and precision she brought to a diagnosis. "I am quite certain of it. I have been applying careful analysis to the symptom pattern for several weeks." He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the first time she had heard him laugh with that particular quality. It transformed his face into something younger and more open and completely devastating. "That is the most Caroline Fairchild way to say that to a person," he said. "Is it wrong?" she asked. "No," he said, and stepped forward and kissed her properly, in the lamplight of the Redemption Creek Main Street with Gray's Anatomy pressed between them and the cold stars above, and not a single other soul on the street to observe it. "It is exactly right." Christmas in Redemption Creek was modest and cold and genuinely warming in the way that community celebrations in isolated places always manage to be. The church put on a small service, the general store decorated its front window, and the saloon served hot cider alongside its usual offerings in a gesture of seasonal tolerance. Caroline stayed in town through the holiday, and Thomas came in for Christmas Day, and the four of them, Thomas, Clement, Caroline, and Caroline's closest friend in the area, a widow named Mee Foster who had been Caroline's patient and had somehow become her confidant, had Christmas dinner at the hotel with the good tablecloths and a genuine appreciation for each other's company. Thomas watched his sister across the table with a happiness that he did not bother to conceal. He had liked Clement from their first real conversation, which had involved Clement listening carefully to Thomas's account of everything that had happened with the deed theft, and then asking a series of questions that demonstrated he had actually heard every word. Thomas had a sharp instinct for people who genuinely listened versus people who performed it, and Clement was the genuine kind. After dinner, when Thomas and me were talking at one end of the table, Clement leaned close to Caroline and said quietly, "Your brother is a good man." "He is," she agreed, "and he is going to need help managing the ranch long term. Two people cannot run a proper cattle operation through a hard winter alone." Caroline looked at him because the sentence was doing more than its literal work and she knew it. "No," she agreed carefully. "They cannot." Clement turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was not a man who spoke before he was ready, and she had learned to give him the space the readiness required. "I was thinking," he said, "about the structure of certain things going forward. My position here is stable. The town council renewed my appointment in October for another 3 years, but Redemption Creek is not far from the ranch. A man could ride it in 2 hours." "Yes," she said. "And a position as sheriff does not preclude a man from investing in a working ranch," he said, "from being a partner in one." "A partnership," she said, because she needed to hear him say it clearly. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the full, honest directness that was his most characteristic quality. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need someone to manage things. You are manifestly capable of managing things. But because I want to share my life with a woman who is my equal in every way that matters. And I have not, until you, met anyone I could honestly say that about." The dining room was warm around them, and Thomas was laughing at something Mee had said, and the Christmas candles were burning low, and Clement was watching her with the patient certainty of someone who has thought carefully before speaking. Caroline thought about the ranch in winter light. She thought about her mother's grave on the eastern slope and her father's books in the study and Thomas's good heart, and the specific texture of a life that had been defined, until now, by what she had given rather than what she had allowed herself to receive. "Yes," she said, because she was herself, "though I should be honest with you that I intend to continue my medical practice and I will not be reducing it on account of marriage." "I would not want you to," he said, and meant it with every molecule of his straightforward nature. "And Thomas will remain at the ranch. It is his home as much as mine, naturally. And I will want to obtain a proper legal partnership agreement for the ranch in both our names." "Wise," he said. "I will speak to the county attorney." She looked at him. "You are really not going to find any of this difficult, are you?" "No," he said simply, "because you are not difficult. You are exactly who you are, and I love who you are. The only difficulty would be if I wanted you to be something else, and I don't." Thomas glanced over at that precise moment, read whatever was written on his sister's face, and turned quietly back to his conversation with me with the satisfied expression of someone who has not been surprised, but is nonetheless glad. They were married in March, 4 days after the conclusion of the Voss trial, which ended in a conviction on 3 counts of deed fraud and 1 count of conspiracy, with a sentence that would keep Harlan Voss in the territorial prison for 8 years. The day the verdict was announced, Clement found Caroline in his office, their shared space now, informally, though the badge and the desk were still his, and told her the news. She absorbed it quietly. Then she said, "The Merrimans. Their land claim reinstatement goes before the judge next month," he said. "With the conviction on record, it is nearly certain to be granted." She exhaled slowly. It was the specific release of someone who has been holding a great deal for a long time. "Good," she said. "That is good." He pulled her close without ceremony, and she let him, pressing her forehead briefly against his shoulder in a gesture that was not something she did easily but that had become, with him, natural. The wedding was small and genuine. The church, the minister who had known Caroline's parents, Thomas as the sole family witness, me Foster as Caroline's attendant, and two of Clement's deputies and their wives who had become genuinely fond of Caroline over the months. Judge Harmon sent a letter of congratulations from the county seat that arrived the following week. Caroline wore her mother's earrings and the green wool dress, and Clement wore his good coat with his badge deliberately left in his desk drawer for the day. When he said the vows, he said them looking directly at her with the complete steadiness that was entirely him, and she said them back with the same quality of full presence. The minister asked if either of them had additional words. Caroline, who was not an impulsive person, had thought about this for 2 weeks and had arrived at a decision. She looked at Clement and said, "I spent years believing that the most important thing I could do was to be capable of everything that needed doing alone. I still believe in being capable. But I have learned from you that accepting a partner who is genuinely your equal is not a reduction of yourself. It is an expansion." She paused. "I intend to remember that." The small congregation was quiet. Me Foster was clearly not entirely in command of her composure. Clement said, "I spent years thinking that the work was enough, that if I did the work well, that was sufficient. I was right that the work matters. But you have shown me what it looks like when someone does work because they genuinely love it, because it is part of who they are rather than something they perform. You have made me want to be better at everything I care about. That is what you do to a person." He paused. "I intend to spend a great many years telling you so." Spring arrived warm and early, and the Fairchild Ranch with its new co-owners had a good season. Clement rode out every Friday evening and returned to town on Monday morning, and this arrangement, which some of the town regarded with mild curiosity, and which me Foster regarded with complete approval, worked with the efficiency of something designed by two intelligent people who had thought it through. The medical practice grew. Caroline's reputation in the outlying communities had always been strong, but with the added stability of the Redemption Creek base and the credibility that, fairly or unfairly, came with the formal association with the county's chief law enforcement officer, she began to see patients who had previously had no access to any medical care at all. She started keeping meticulous notes, in the careful hand her father had taught her, of every case symptoms, treatments, outcomes. She was building something she thought of as a record, though she did not have a formal word for it yet. One evening in June, she showed Clement a particular notation about a plant compound she had refined, which she believed was more effective for wound care than anything currently available through the standard medical supply chains. He read her notes with the thorough attention he brought to evidence review, asked several precise questions, and then said, "You should write this up formally and submit it to a medical journal." She stared at him. "I do not have a medical degree." "No," he said. "But you have 11 years of documented clinical practice, and a case record that would be the envy of most formally trained physicians I have read about. The notes you have been keeping are essentially a research record." He handed her paper back. "Write it up, send it, see what happens." She sent it in August. The response arrived in October and was encouraging enough that she sat with it for a long time. By October, she knew she was expecting their first child. She told Clement on a Friday evening when he arrived at the ranch, and she told him in the direct, clear manner that was characteristic of her, not with elaborate staging, simply as information that was also, unmistakably, something more. His face did something she had never seen it do before. The steadiness was still there, but it was illuminated from the inside, the way a lantern looks when you turn the flame higher, and he pulled her into his arms with a careful, fierce tenderness that said everything the words had not yet had time to reach. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair, because he knew enough about her work to ask the medical question first. "I am very well," she said. "The pregnancy appears to be uncomplicated. I have been monitoring the relevant indicators." He laughed low and warm against her hair. "Of course you have. I have also been thinking," she said, "about where we should properly live. The current arrangement works, but the ride twice weekly in winter is harder than summer, and I have been thinking the same thing," he said. "The deputy can take more responsibility. I could operate the sheriff's duties from here as easily as from town, with a day or two per week in the office. And if the town council finds that insufficient, they are welcome to hire someone else, and I will find other useful employment." She pulled back to look at him. "You would give up the badge for this?" "I would not have to," he said. "I think the arrangement is workable, but yes, if it came to that." He held her eyes. "Yes." She pressed her face briefly back against his shoulder, and he felt the particular quality of her stillness that he knew by now meant she was moved. "Let us not make them choose yet," she said. "Let us see how the arrangement works." The arrangement worked well. Clement maintained his role as sheriff with an efficiency that owed a great deal to the fact that he had spent 4 years building a competent team. And the town council, after an initial conversation that Clement conducted with the same patient authority he brought to everything, agreed to a modified schedule that accommodated the practical realities. He spent 3 days per week in town and 4 at the ranch, and the telegraphic wire that had been strung to the nearest relay station meant that urgent matters could reach him quickly when needed. The Merriman family's land claim was formally reinstated in November, the same month that Caroline's medical notes were accepted for publication in a medical journal out of St. Louis, a qualified but genuine acknowledgement that her documented observations regarding wound care compounds had merit worth distributing. The letter of acceptance arrived on a cold Tuesday, and she read it standing in the kitchen of the ranch house while the morning light came through the window, and felt the specific satisfaction of something her father would have been proud of. She set the letter on the kitchen table and went to find Clement, who was outside tending to the horses with Thomas. She said, "They accepted it." Clement looked at her across the yard, and the expression on his face, the full, unguarded pride of someone who loves you and is proud of you without any reservation or ambivalence, was something she had to look away from briefly, because it was overwhelming in the best possible way. Thomas said, "Accepted what?" And Caroline gave him the short version while Clement watched her explain it, and thought that he was the luckiest man in the territory of New Mexico, which was not a thought he would have expected to be thinking at 35, but which was simply true. Their son arrived in late January of 1884, during a cold snap that covered the eastern ridge in a thin layer of ice that caught the winter sun and made the world look briefly like something out of a story. Caroline delivered with the methodical calm of someone who had attended many births and knew exactly what was happening and what to expect, though Mee Foster and a competent midwife from town were both present, and Clement was exactly where Caroline told him to be, which was in the room and holding her hand and being entirely steadfast. They named him Arthur, for Caroline's father. Thomas, who had been pacing in the kitchen for 4 hours, was allowed in immediately after, and stood for a long time looking at his nephew, with an expression that suggested he was doing quiet, grateful arithmetic about the nature of family. Arthur Redmond grew in the way of babies on frontier ranches, surrounded by open space and practical competence, and the constant presence of people who loved him with the specific fierceness of those who have not taken any of it for granted. He was a serious infant and a curious toddler, and he would eventually, at the age of 3, toddle into his mother's medical room and attempt to examine her instruments with a methodical interest that made Caroline look at Clement over the child's head with an expression of complete, helpless delight. The Voss case continued its legal life through the territorial appeals system, as such cases did, but the foundation was solid and the conviction held. By 1885, Harlan Voss's land holdings in the valley had been formally reviewed, and 3 parcels that had been obtained through fraudulent means were subject to reversal proceedings. The cattle operation, now managed by a legitimate enterprise that purchased it from the estate, continued to operate without the predatory ambitions of its previous owner. Redemption Creek changed, as all frontier towns did, through the gradual accumulation of people and structures, and the slow hardening of a settlement into something that resembled permanence. A proper school was established in 1884. A second doctor arrived in 1885 and was immediately brought under Caroline's informal mentorship in the particulars of the local plant pharmacopoeia, and the land registry, now under a new, considerably more careful registrar following Dunmore's retirement, implemented a dual verification system for all deed filings. Caroline had suggested the dual verification system to the county officer in a letter she wrote in 1884. He had implemented it in 1885. She had not sought credit for it and had not received formal credit for it, and she was entirely at peace with this, because the outcome was what mattered, and the outcome was that the mechanism of the theft that had taken her deed could not be easily repeated. "You reorganized the territorial land registry process," Clement said, when she showed him the notice that the new system had been formally adopted. "I made a suggestion," she said, "based on a systematic analysis of how the existing system had been exploited." "Yes, that is called reorganizing the process," he said. She considered this. "I suppose it is." He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and she laughed quietly against his collar. By the summer of 1885, the ranch had expanded modestly, 2 additional hands hired with genuine care for fair wages and decent conditions, which Caroline had insisted upon, and which had created exactly the team cohesion she had predicted it would. Thomas had taken on more operational responsibility and had met a young woman named Sarah, a schoolteacher who had arrived with the new school and who had, within 6 months, made Thomas's previously unremarkable evening hours considerably more interesting. Caroline liked Sarah immediately, which was not always true of people she met quickly. Sarah was intelligent and direct and asked good questions, and she treated Thomas with the combination of warmth and respect that Caroline had always hoped someone would bring to her brother. "She is right for him," Caroline told Clement one evening, watching Thomas and Sarah talk across the yard. "Yes," Clement agreed, with the comfortable certainty of someone who has been paying attention. Arthur was 18 months old and deeply interested in attempting to walk with the same purposeful speed that all the adults around him seemed to manage, and was finding this aspiration somewhat inconsistently achievable. He was sitting between his parents, making determined progress toward a particularly interesting stick he had identified, and the evening light was long and gold, and the smell of the ranch in summer was the particular combination of hay and dry grass and horse and wood smoke that Caroline would, for the rest of her long life, associate with the specific texture of happiness. The horseshoe nail sat in a small wooden box on the mantelpiece of their ranch house. She had put it there on the day they moved the household together, and when Clement had raised an eyebrow at her choice of keepsake, she had said, "It is where this started. It deserves to be remembered." He had looked at it for a moment, and then at her, and she thought she saw in his expression the same compressed, full feeling that she carried in herself when she thought about the specific unlikely chain of events that had led from a horseshoe nail in the dirt of an alley to an October night in a sheriff's office to this evening on the porch of a ranch that was theirs. "An irrelevant clue," he said. "As it was initially assessed," she said, without malice. "I owe you a permanent acknowledgement of that error," he said. "You have been acknowledging it since March," she said, "in considerable detail." He smiled, and it was the warm, unguarded one. "I intend to continue." Arthur reached the stick, achieved it with enormous satisfaction, and turned to present it to his nearest parent, which happened to be his father. Clement accepted the stick with the gravity that the offering deserved. Caroline watched them and felt the specific quality of a life that has been honestly and fully built, the weight of it, and the warmth, and the way it fit. In 1886, Thomas and Sarah were married in the same church where Caroline and Clement had spoken their vows 3 years earlier, and the small congregation included the Merriman family, who had returned to their restored land and had become neighbors in the genuine frontier sense of the word. Robert Merriman had developed a particular fondness for Clement, with whom he shared the practical satisfaction of men who work the same kind of difficult, variable, consequential ground, though in different vocations. Caroline delivered Sarah and Thomas's first child in the spring of 1887, a boy they named Arthur as well, which created a delightful naming overlap that both families found more amusing than confusing. And the ranch house felt, for the first time, like the full family structure that Caroline's parents had originally built it to hold. Clement's second term as sheriff concluded in 1887, and when the town council offered a third appointment, he accepted, because the work still mattered and he was still good at it, and Redemption Creek was a better place than it had been when he arrived, which was the only meaningful measure he applied to the question. His deputy, a young man named Harris who had turned out to be precisely the kind of careful, attentive law enforcement officer that Clement had hoped to develop over several years of deliberate mentorship, handled the bulk of the day-to-day management with an increasingly confident hand. Clement was present and available and authoritative when authority was needed, and delegated with a generosity that reflected his secure relationship with his own competence. Caroline published a second paper in 1887, this one addressing the specific challenges of diagnosing and treating respiratory conditions in the high desert environment, based on the case records she had been keeping since her father's time. The response was more substantive than the first 2 letters from physicians in established eastern cities, one requesting copies of her full case records for comparative study, one offering a formal professional correspondence that she accepted with the careful epistolary thoroughness she brought to all significant commitments. She was sitting at the kitchen table one evening, writing her reply to the Eastern physician, when Clement came in from outside. He looked over her shoulder, read the opening lines of her letter, and said, "He wants your case records." "Yes. Are you going to send them?" She paused in her writing. "I am considering whether to transcribe them first. Some of the earlier records are in my father's hand, and I want to preserve those separately." He was quiet for a moment, and she heard the particular silence that meant he was thinking about something tangential to what was being discussed. "What?" she asked. "I was thinking," he said, "that what you are building the case records, the publications, the correspondence is going to outlast the individual practice of a healer in one New Mexico territory town." She put down her pen. "What do you mean?" He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, and the lamplight was good on his face, the face she had learned to read as well as any set of clinical signs she had ever studied. "I mean that the work you are doing is larger than a single medical practice in Redemption Creek, and I wonder if you have thought about that." She had thought about it. She had been thinking about it in the private way that she thought about large things, which was to say carefully and without arriving at premature conclusions. "I have thought about it," she said, and she looked at him. The ranch house was quiet around them, Arthur asleep in the back room, the night sounds of the land audible through the walls. The horseshoe nail on the mantelpiece caught a glint of lamplight. "I think," she said slowly, "that the most useful thing I can do is exactly what I am doing. Building the record, making it rigorous, making it available. A formally trained physician in the city has access to the latest journals and the latest techniques, but he does not have 11 years of documented outcomes from treating patients in this specific environment with these specific resources. That knowledge is valuable, and it will be lost if someone does not preserve it." Clement nodded. "Then preserve it." "I intend to," she said. And then, because the evening was full and warm and the man across the table from her was exactly as he had always been, "Thank you for seeing it." "I always see you," he said simply. "That has been entirely involuntary from the beginning." She reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat for a while in the good quiet of the ranch house in the New Mexico night, and the record she was building and the life they had built, and the people they were together all occupied the same warm space. By 1888, Redemption Creek had a proper telegraph office, a schoolhouse with 30 students, a small but functional library funded by a modest public collection, and a growing sense of itself as a place that intended to be around for a long time. The valley was settled, the land registry was honest, and the families who had fought for their claims in the difficult years of the early decade were beginning to see the harvests that permanence produces. Caroline and Clement's second child arrived in the summer of 1888, a girl they named Helen, for Caroline's mother, and for a woman whose love of both learning and landscape had shaped the family that stood now in the ranch house kitchen on a summer morning with Arthur 4 years old and fiercely interested in the new arrival, and Thomas standing in the doorway with Sarah and their own young son. All of them crowded into the warm space of a life that had been built from a theft and a nail and a stubbornly intelligent woman who had walked into a sheriff's office and refused to be wrong. Helen was small and dark-haired and looked, according to Thomas, exactly like their mother, which made Caroline hold her with a specific tenderness that had several layers and all of them mattered. Clement held his daughter in his large, careful hands and looked at her with the expression he reserved for things that were so good that the appropriate response required silence. Then Arthur asked if the baby could walk yet, and the practical demands of a 4-year-old's curiosity restored the room to its functional state, and Caroline laughed, and Clement laughed, and me Foster, who had been there for the delivery and was staying for supper, said that it was the finest household in the whole territory, and she intended to continue visiting it indefinitely, which everyone agreed was entirely appropriate. The horseshoe nail remained on the mantelpiece. Years later, when Arthur was old enough to ask about it, Caroline told him the story from the beginning. She told him about the missing deed and the land registry, and the alley beside the building where the faint marks of a pried latch were long since weathered away. She told him about the smithy and Silas Prout's custom dye, and the 3 horses she had been tending. She told him about walking into the sheriff's office and laying the nail on the desk of a man who had initially told her it was irrelevant. Arthur listened with the focused seriousness he had inherited from both of his parents and said, "But you were right." "Yes," she said. "How did you know you were right?" She thought about how to answer this with the precision it deserved. "Because I had done the work," she said. "Because I had paid attention for years to things that other people overlooked, and I trusted what I had learned. And when someone told me that what I knew did not matter, I trusted myself over the dismissal." Arthur thought about this. "And the sheriff, he believed you in the end." "He did," she said. "And the important thing was not only that he believed me, but that he acknowledged he had been wrong. That takes a different kind of strength than being right in the first place. Being right is only the beginning. What you do with the truth afterward is what shapes things." She told him about his grandfather's land. She told him about the Merrimans and about Decker, and about the search warrant and the tin box opened in front of witnesses in an October yard. She told him all of it, including the part she had not told him before, that standing in a stranger's office arguing over a piece of metal no bigger than her thumb, she had recognized something in the quality of a man's willingness to be wrong that had changed the direction of everything. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the unguarded simplicity of a child who has grown up in a house full of honesty, "Is that when you started to love him?" Caroline looked at the nail on the mantelpiece, and then at the door through which, at that moment, the sound of Clement's horse in the yard was audible, returning from town in the long summer evening. "I think," she said, "that was the beginning of it, yes." The door opened. Clement came in, bringing with him the smell of horse and leather and dry summer air, and he paused in the doorway when he saw them. His wife and his son, sitting together in the kitchen light, and the expression on his face was the illuminated one, the one she had seen first on a December evening in a hotel dining room when she had told him with careful precision that she was in love with him. "Papa," Arthur said, "Mama was telling me about the nail." "The irrelevant clue," Clement said, hanging up his coat, his voice carrying the warm note of a shared history. "As it was initially assessed," Caroline said, meeting his eyes across the room. He crossed to where she sat and kissed her in the brief, unself-conscious way of two people who have been deeply in love for a long time, and for whom the expression of it has become as natural as breathing. Arthur made the sound that children make when adults behave with predictable romance, which was somewhere between exasperation and fond acceptance. Helen, who was 4 months old and entirely indifferent to the complexities of adult emotion, made a small contented sound from her cradle by the window. The ranch held them all. The land was theirs, fully and beyond challenge, registered and verified, and surrounded by the documentation of 11 years of Fairchild work and 3 years of the combined Redmond enterprise. The case that had threatened it was closed. The man who had orchestrated the threat was in a territorial prison and would not be released until his children were grown. The families whose deeds had been taken had their land back, or compensation toward it, or at minimum the formal legal record that their loss had been wrongful, and their lives disrupted by someone else's deliberate crime. Caroline's medical records, now spanning 14 years and nearly 1,000 documented cases, were in correspondence with 3 academic physicians and had contributed to 2 published studies. The second-generation medical vocabulary she had developed for high-desert frontier conditions, the specific compounds, the specific symptom patterns, the specific treatment modifications required by altitude and climate, and the particular resources available, was beginning to travel beyond the territory in the papers that bore her name. Clement had served as sheriff for a decade. The badge had become, over years, simply a part of who he was in Redemption Creek, not a symbol of power but of presence, of the specific, patient attention he brought to keeping the peace between people who wanted very different things from the same piece of difficult, beautiful land. They grew old in the ranch house with the good light and the sound of the land and the particular fullness of a life that had been built on honesty with the world, with each other, and with themselves. The horseshoe nail stayed on the mantelpiece, a dark, small, entirely unremarkable object that had once been the pivot point of everything. Arthur Redmond grew into his parents' best qualities with a thoroughness that suggested genetics and proximity working in concert. His mother's precise intelligence, his father's patient steadiness, and his own particular quality of warmth that was entirely his own. He would eventually study law, which his mother had predicted when he was 7, and which his father greeted with complete satisfaction. Helen grew into a force of independent, will so pronounced that her parents looked at each other over her head on a regular basis with expressions of recognition and something very close to awe. She wanted to study medicine. This did not surprise anyone. Caroline, when Helen told her formally at the age of 12, took the announcement with the seriousness it deserved, and immediately began supplementing her daughter's education with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for years. Thomas and Sarah had 2 more children, filling the secondary wing of the ranch house with noise and energy, and the Fairchild land that had nearly been stolen and replaced with Harlan Voss's brand became instead the foundation of 2 families who worked it with the combined effort of people who understood exactly what had once almost been taken from them. The Merrimans were their neighbors. They celebrated harvests together and helped each other through hard winters with the specific, unglamorous generosity of frontier neighboring that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the understanding that the land demands cooperation. Redemption Creek continued its slow, stubborn process of becoming a real town. The school grew. A library formed around the donations of several families, including a considerable collection of medical and botanical references from Caroline that she earmarked for the use of any future healer who needed them. The land registry, with its dual verification system, processed deed after deed without incident. And on an evening in the late autumn of some year much further along, when the children were grown and the ranch was in capable hands, and the light was still the same extraordinary New Mexico light that had been falling on the dry grass since before anyone could remember, Caroline and Clement sat together on the porch, and the silence between them had the quality that only decades of honest love can produce. A silence so full of shared meaning that words would have been redundant. He reached over and took her hand. She turned hers to hold his. The nail on the mantelpiece caught the last of the light through the window. They had walked from it together, and they had arrived here, at a life that was complete and whole and thoroughly, irreversibly, beautifully theirs. Not despite who she was, or despite who he was, but because both of them had been, from the beginning, exactly who they were, and had been fortunate enough to recognize in each other someone worth being fully known by. The ranch was quiet. The stars were coming out over the eastern ridge, where Helen Fairchild's grave had stood for many years, and where Arthur Fairchild's grave stood now beside it, and where the dry grass moved in the evening wind in the way it had always moved, indifferent and beautiful and precisely the same. Caroline Redmond, née Fairchild, healer and diagnostician, and the woman who had once walked into a sheriff's office with a horseshoe nail and refused to be wrong, watched the first stars appear and felt the particular peace of someone who has done the work, all of it, the hard and the tender and the precise and the uncertain, and has not, at any point, pretended to be less than she was. And Sheriff Clement Redmond, who had been wrong once about something very important and had been grateful every day since for the woman who had corrected him, held her hand in the cool autumn evening, and thought that the territory was a fine place, and the work had been worth doing, and this ordinary, extraordinary, irreplaceable moment of existing beside her was the truest thing he had ever known. The end was not an ending at all, but simply the point at which the story had arrived at everything it had always been moving toward, and which required no further explanation because it was complete, and it was good, and it was theirs.